Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, I'm the host, and thank you for joining today. And on the previous episode during this intro time, I talked about how much I love words. I'm kind of a word nerd. I love how descriptive you can get with them and using words that not everyone uses sometimes. And then many of you reached out and said, you're the exact same way, which made me feel better about myself. I'm not as weird as I thought I was when it comes to words. But then several of you also said that you like to intentionally mispronounce words for no reason whatsoever. Let me tell you, I've never felt more seen in my entire life. I do that too. I don't do it on this podcast because that would be weird. You'd be wondering, why is Joe saying paradigm like paradigm? Because if you didn't know I do that, then you'd just think I'm an idiot. And I didn't start it until I had a kid. And when he was growing up, you know how kids mispronounce words and it's cute. Like to this day, for example, I still say something instead of something because he was little and he would say something instead of I need to go get something. He would say I need to go get something. Also, when he was reading, he would read the word original as organal. And I thought that was cute. And to this day, I will still say organal around him. And he says it back. And he's 17 years old. But anyway, I'm just glad that I'm not the only one that does weird stuff like that. All right, if you are brand new to listening to this podcast, please make sure you subscribe to 10-Minute Murder so that you can always be able to find the show and never miss an episode. And connect with 10-Minute Murder on social media. If you have friends and they also like true crime stories, please let them know about this podcast as well. Links are in the show notes of this episode and at 10minutemurder.com. Now, to the story. True crime cases often use the principle of Occam's razor. In other words, the most simple explanation for a crime is usually the correct one. But sometimes, a murder simply takes a turn for the bizarre, and the investigation leads to discoveries that nobody could have anticipated. One of these tip-of-the-iceberg cases is the 2010 murder of Tina Herman. When 32-year-old Tina Herman didn't show up for work on the 10th of November, her manager, Valerie, was immediately worried. Tina was the mother of two young children, 13-year-old Sarah and 9-year-old Cody. She had a reputation for being reliable, trustworthy, and upbeat. It wasn't like her to take a day off work without calling to let Valerie know first. The next day came, and there was still no sign of Tina, and Sarah and Cody's school had reported both children as absent. What's more, Tina's best friend, Stephanie Sprang, was also missing. Valerie called the police for a wellness check on Tina, but after calling their mutual friends and discovering that nobody had seen or heard from Tina in days, Valerie felt like it was time to take action. She went to Tina's house alone, a decision that she would remember for the rest of her life. The door was locked, so Valerie broke into Tina's house. As soon as she stepped foot in the hallway, she knew something was horribly wrong. The floor was covered with pooled blood, which was also splattered on the walls and furniture. Valerie made a second phone call to the police and told them there's blood everywhere. When the police arrived, they were baffled by what they found. Despite the huge amounts of blood in the house, there was absolutely no sign of Tina, Sarah, Cody, or Stephanie, except for one single bloody footprint that was identified as Sarah's. In most missing person cases, the culprit is known to the victims. So authorities honed in on one, Greg Borders, a recent boyfriend of Tina's with whom she had had a tumultuous relationship. But Greg had an airtight alibi for the night Tina and her children had vanished. He'd been at work, then he spent the night with a friend. With Greg ruled out as a suspect, the investigators looked back at the scarce evidence they'd gathered from the crime scene. In the garage of Tina's house, there was a collection of new trash bags and sheets of tarpaulin. Investigators used this piece of knowledge together with the cleaning spray that had been used on some parts of the blood spatter and realized that the culprit had been trying to clean up after themselves. This led them to a wild theory. Maybe the culprit had left the house at some point to purchase further cleaning supplies. Scrolling through Walmart security footage at approximately the time of the attack, investigators saw somebody suspicious, a man who made a beeline for the garbage bags and tarps in the store. The footage showed this man walking to his car, a Toyota Yaris. Filtering through local Toyota Yaris owners led authorities to one name, Matthew Hoffman. He had an extensive criminal record, even serving time in prison for burglary and arson. Identifying Matthew as a suspect led to a shocking revelation. A deputy remembered pulling over Matthew on the night that Tina and her children went missing. The deputy had stopped Matthew because he was trying to drive into a closed parking lot in the Yaris. Matthew replied that he was just waiting until his girlfriend finished work. At that time, Tina, Sarah, and Cody hadn't even been reported missing, so the deputy had no way of knowing that he was talking to their assailant. In hindsight, one detail made the deputy's blood run cold. Matthew had told him that his girlfriend's name was Sarah. Matthew Hoffman didn't have a girlfriend, but that was the name of one of the missing children. So who is this person of interest in the Toyota Yaris? Matthew Hoffman was a 30-year-old man who loved nature and had worked as a tree trimmer throughout his adult life. When things go wrong, we tend to cling to what we know, and when Matthew's life began to go downhill, he became more and more obsessed with trees and the outdoors. Once he'd scaled the branches of a tree, Matthew would perch there, hidden from sight, watching his neighbors go about their lives. Sometimes he would patiently wait until a squirrel was at arm's length, then grab it and store it in a freezer to later eat. Watching his neighbors from a specific patch of woods behind his house became routine. Matthew started to feel like he truly knew them, what time they woke up, what time they went to work, and what they did for fun. On the night the Herman family disappeared, Matthew attempted to break into their house and rob them. Tina arrived home early, startling Matthew, who hit her in the back of the head. When this did not subdue her, he stabbed her with a hunting knife. While he was attacking Tina, her friend Stephanie Sprang came over to visit and interrupted the attack. Matthew quickly stabbed Stephanie as well. With both Tina and Stephanie dead or dying, Matthew then killed Tina's dog, which was barking in panic. Matthew then dragged Tina and Stephanie into the bathroom and dismembered their bodies in the bathtub. It was at this time that Sarah and Cody arrived home. Cody was murdered just like Tina and Stephanie, but Sarah's fate was very different. What police didn't know was, at the same time they were viewing the surveillance footage of Matthew in Walmart, Sarah Herman was trapped inside Matthew Hoffman's house, fighting desperately to stay alive. On November 14th, investigators raided Matthew's home, taking a sleeping Matthew into custody. What they found inside the house was totally out of right field. It was filled with leaves. Piles and piles of leaves covered every inch: the furniture, the floor, the walls. Initially, police thought the piles of leaves were hiding the bodies of the missing family, but there was no sign of them. There was, however, one living person tucked away in the crawl space of the house. Sarah was found chained to a wall, naked except for a makeshift plastic diaper, sprawled on a pile of leaves as if she was sitting on a nest. She remembered the attack on her family and trying to scream for help, then being stuffed into a car with a blindfold over her eyes. Although she didn't realize it at the time, the objects in the car next to her were the dismembered bodies of her family. During her time in captivity, Matthew had sexually assaulted 13-year-old Sarah, fed her rotten food, and chained her up next to him while he slept. Sarah had no idea how much time had passed, and Matthew had told her that her family was still alive. Investigators had to break the tragic news to Sarah once they realized that she had not witnessed the murders. One person had been recovered alive, but where were the bodies of the other victims? Matthew initially didn't cooperate with investigators, but after saying that he had a horrifying nightmare that jogged his memory about the crimes, he agreed to write down the location of the bodies on a piece of paper, but only if detectives agreed to shoot him dead before receiving the paper. Detectives understandably refused. 2 days later, Matthew agreed to reveal the location of the bodies if he was given a lighter sentence. It turned out that Matthew's obsession with trees had taken an even more sinister turn. The dismembered remains of Tina, Stephanie, and Cody were found in the trunk of a hollow birch tree that was more than 60 feet tall. Matthew seemed much more emotionally invested in the well-being of the birch tree, which he worried would be chopped down, than he did the lives that he had taken and the young girl he had traumatized. Although it never became clear whether the crimes were truly a burglary gone wrong, investigators suspected that Matthew had indeed planned to murder the family and kidnap Sarah from the beginning. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, only saved from the death penalty by the plea deal he had accepted. Despite Matthew's concerns about saving the tree he had disposed of the bodies in, it was cut down shortly after the corpses were retrieved. Sarah, now an adult, has vowed to live the kind of life that her mother would have wanted. Matthew Hoffman took many things from his victims, but that was one thing that he could not take away.